Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Good morning. This is The Open Door. I'm Jim Hanning, and I've been joined by some friends this morning, as usual. Dr. Rhonda Shervin, philosopher, prolific Catholic author, and we have a student among us. We need more. John Breen, who has much to say, and from a good student perspective. And we have Desmond Silvera, member of the American Solidarity Party, a member of the national committee thereof, who is seriously considering running for governor in the state of California. And as a special guest today, we have Norm Chouinard from Connecticut. He leads the American Solidarity Party in Connecticut. And before we get started, Norm, I think you have a little sneak preview of something good that's about to happen.
Well, thank you, and thank you for welcoming me. One of the things I would like to accomplish today is make an announcement based on behalf of American Solidarity Party of Connecticut. We have a friendly working relationship with author Joseph Pierce, and due to his good graces, we have worked together to obtain 100 copies of his most recent book on distributism, which is a restatement of E.F. Schumacher's landmark book, Small is Beautiful. The name of this book is Small is Still Beautiful. It's an updated version of Schumacher's 1970 book. And Small is Still Beautiful, Economics as If Families Mattered. I have, with the help of Joseph Pierce, I have obtained 100 copies of this, and I'm announcing today that nationwide I would love to distribute all 100 copies to anyone who does not have the book and verbally commits to reading the book. They can reach me at either at our Facebook page at ASP Connecticut, or they can reach me at the email address of info@aspconnecticut.org. And if you reach me in either location and verbally commit to reading the book and are willing to work using this book on behalf of the American Solidarity Party, I would be happy and honored to distribute this book to you, meaning everybody in the listening audience. So, that's the announcement.
Okay, I'm the first one that's going to do this email. Incidentally, none of you may have noticed this fact, but there are people like me who are retired professors who have lived simply all our lives, and we are part of the poor now. So we like to see initiatives like that. For us, $20 for a book is not something we would do automatically, even though we're very interested. So since I met Joseph Pierce years ago, and I love his writings, and I would love to read the book, but I wrote down that you should say it more slowly what your name is. So if we write to info@ASP, is it ASP dot? No, ASPConn.org.
No, not that. Let's get that right. It's ASP Connecticut, fully spelled out. So that's ASPConnecticut.org. Info@aspconnecticut.org.
And with our pledge that we will read it, we address you as who?
And my name is...
No one's going to remember your name.
Right. That's okay. My name is Norm. Last name is Chouinard. But if you call me Norm or call me anything that's recognizable, with a name like Chouinard, I answer to a lot of things. And if you can, if you write to me at that address and give me a way to send it to you, I will do so. And that's for everybody in the listening audience.
Let me jump in, Jim, again, for just a couple of minutes here. Norm, two things. And the first thing I'm going to pass over in silence. People wonder why Connecticut is called the nutmeg state, but I'm going to pass over that question in silence. Now, going on to the second question. Isn't it true that Joseph Pierce, in discussing distributism, is bringing forward the legacy of not only G.K. Chesterton, but also Leo XIII?
Oh yes, and several popes and all of the encyclicals beyond Rerum Novarum, up to, and I don't want to miss anybody, but up to the JP2 II, John Paul II's. I'll mess up the Latin, so I will just let it pass. So there's a very long line of Hilaire Belloc, who even Chesterton said, I am just a follower. Hilaire Belloc is the leader of this group. And updated by E.F. Schumacher in the 70s and made even more contemporary by Joseph Pierce in his most recent book on this topic. So, no, there is a long line of writers and people of people of intellectual brilliance who have a lot to say, and when you say when you get into the topic of distributism, you often find a lot of people kind of sneer at it, and I really think it is because of lack of information. So I'm hopeful that a book like this, while certainly not a panacea, will get us all to speak the same language.
Excellent, and it's certainly the case that the American Solidarity Party, among all parties, major and minor, is the only party to have a very public commitment to the distributist position. And I think it's a wonderful thing that Joseph Pierce is doing and that you are doing.
Thank you.
Let's turn now to our format, which is a flexible format. What we've been doing in recent months, because it has been for months now, is working our way through the several planks of the American Solidarity Party, and we're at the next to last plank, partly because it can be a technical matter, and partly because that's how things have worked out as we explored the platform. And this plank is the banking and finance in the public interest plank. And it has just a two-sentence introduction, and then is followed by bullet points, actually 7 or 8 bullet points. Let me read first the two-sentence introduction, and the first reading of it, I'll do a little annotating, and then the second reading of it, because our hearers might very well not be familiar with it at all, the second reading, which is necessary, will be without any annotation on my part, and then I invite all of you panel members to say what you have to say, well, whether it's controversial or not controversial. Access to capital. Access to capital is necessary for families and small businesses to prosper. First annotation. The Pelican Party is going to be present at a conference here in Southern California, and one of the organizers of the conference read the platform, said he was very happy to see our pro-life commitment, but thought that we had a drift towards socialism. Well, I did what I could to dissuade him, And were we to look at this initial sentence here, access to capital is necessary for small businesses and families. Well, that's not a socialist position at all. Classically, socialism is the view that the state ought to own the means of production and be involved in the economic regulation of those means of production. However, what we're saying is capitalism is a good thing, but it has to be distributed. It's good for families, it's good for small businesses. We continue. Ensuring widespread access to credit on fair lending terms. Ensuring widespread access to credit on fair lending terms. I think a great many Christians today, were they to do a Bible study on discussions of usury in the Old Testament, would have a dropping jaw phenomenon. The notion that lending has to be fair and not usurious is at the very heart, I think, of Old Testament ethical concerns. And it's interesting, this has to be a sidebar, but there's a very developed Muslim position on lending. And I'm certainly not a Muslim, and I'm certainly not interested in suggesting that the Muslim position is entirely correct. But the fact that they take it seriously, I think, is of serious interest. At any rate, ensuring access to credit on fair lending terms is essential to building shared prosperity. There is a view, I'm lingering over here on prosperity, that somehow we should steer clear of prosperity. And of course, some definitions of prosperity include not a chicken in every pot, but a swimming pool in every backyard. And when we talk about prosperity, we're talking about a decent sort of prosperity, not having to wonder where your next rent payment is coming from, and not wondering where your next meal is coming from, and not wondering whether you're going to be hired for 2 weeks or only 2 days. But prosperity is a legitimate goal. It's a good thing. So, fair lending capital is essential to building prosperity and stable communities. And stable communities are at risk. There are few stable communities, and we've spoken about opioid abuse, and one of the reasons for that is the lack of stable community life. One of the reasons for it. Well, without annotation, one more time. Access to capital is necessary for families and small businesses to prosper. Ensuring widespread access to credit on fair lending terms is essential to building shared prosperity and stable communities. Thoughts, panel members?
Well, of course I have a thought. So, right. So, I read something about the whole change from saying that lending money was intrinsically wrong, that many people thought because of those passages in Scripture, etc., etc. And I get into this issue in this way because there were Catholics who were saying, since the Church changed its teaching on usury and changed its teaching on slavery, the Church can change its teaching on contraception. So I decided I would look into that claim and see if it really changed. So when I'm reading about usury, it says it changed from saying that it's unnatural to make any money on money instead of on goods, had to do with the fact that the contemporaries at the time, in those long gone centuries, as soon as you switch to banking, then this whole thing changed, not in terms of the principle that usury was wrong, but as to what was considered usury versus good lending policies. So I wondered if anyone wanted to speak to that, whether that's an accurate, because I'm not into finance at all, so I was just doing this from an ethical point of view. And I'm wondering, first of all, whether that's accurate, and secondly, whether I've expressed it wrongly. Because, of course, it's key to this, because you can't really say no family could be prosperous without credit. I mean, a small family in a village, in a small town, could eat what they produced and be very prosperous and stable. It doesn't need a loan to do that.
I'd like to comment, if I may.
Yes.
What Dr. Shervin said, I'm pretty sure is correct. I took an economics course last January from Holy Apostles with Professor Jordan as my professor, and one of our assignments was to watch a documentary on the whole banking process. So indeed, that's how kind of started, where usury was initially prohibited by both Jews, Muslims, and by the Catholic Church. However, the Jews did have one clause where in Scripture they were allowed to use usury when loaning money to Gentiles. So that's kind of where they became the most profitable in their money lending, and that was one reason why they were discriminated against in Italy. And we have an example of that from Shakespeare's play, The Merchant of Venice, where there's a conflict between the borrower and the lender just happens to be Jewish. So usury was very looked down upon, even by the Catholic Church. But what happened was that the bankers came up with this different system of banking where instead of us so much lending you money, we will borrow your money and pay you for it. And that was the spin-off to the modern banking that we have now.
Norm, does any of this ring any bells?
Yep. No, as a matter of the business models, yeah, I think when we understand the Catholic understanding of property, it involves an aspect of finance, and in that regard, the notion of banking has a much different has a different function, a unique function as compared to reading the Old Testament and reading the prohibitions on usury reflected a reality that is in an economic system that is not the case now. So, as a business model, banks, basically do as was just said. My friend, the student. What is your first name? I apologize.
Don.
Tom? Yeah.
Don.
Okay. Tom. You said Don?
John.
John. Okay. I'm very sorry. I should have paid better attention. And as John said, I think we're in a we have a different model now with the idea of having property, including that financial aspect to it, and the banking aspect to it being as easily accessible, as widely accessible as possible. Really is not, if we were reading things as they would have been understood in those days, I think this is a natural extrapolation of where we are with banking in this day and age, and how it can be used for good and how it can be used for bad. And so the idea being, as the party says, to try to make try to make the availability of property as widely accessible and as fairly accessible as possible to the greatest number of people, involves this more modern banking concept and business model.
We are left with two scriptural zingers here. One, neither a lender nor a borrower be, which is familiar, I think, to many people, and the other is lend without hope of return. However, those scriptural zingers have to be incorporated within a much broader framework, and I thank John and Norm for doing that. Let's go ahead then to the bullet points. We therefore, the party, therefore, support, number one, the operation of credit and similar financial institutions in the interests of borrowers and lenders, not stock market speculators. And we support the advancement of credit unions. I remember the day, little annotation, in which it was commonplace for a parish to have its own credit union. And the advancement of credit unions, mutual insurance companies, annotation, that's really what made the Knights of Columbus go. Mutual insurance companies and other cooperative forms of ownership for financial enterprises. Now, Desmond has not said anything yet, and so I think it's natural for him to chime in here. And if he doesn't, I might have to call him Sebastian.
Sure. So, what this what this brought to my mind was I work for a company that promotes the use of credit unions. It's a credit card consolidation company. And I really wanted to hear from Norm, because I know Norm is in the banking world, a community banking world. In my line of work, I've heard lots of bad things about banks and how credit unions are the better option. I guess I wanted to hear from Norm his perspective on what makes community banks better than the big banks.
Okay. Well, this would go beyond the parties. Some of what I would have to say would go beyond the parties' platform, but I would say that community banking is the business model of community banking, and that's defined in a legal sense because some banks are chartered as community banks, some banks are chartered as national banks, some banks are chartered as investment banks. The general public very often does not perceive much of a distinction between the three. We go back in history, in recent history, a little bit back to the financial crisis of 2000, of the end of the last decade. What essentially happened in that crisis was a stark contrast between community banks, national banks, and investment banks. Community banks, stock and trade is the community that they work in, largely, and what that fleshes out to means is savings accounts, checking accounts, single-family mortgages, things that actually improve the lives of a very wide number of people. And community banks, essentially, and the thing to remember about a community bank that's different from a national bank is that if a national bank the National Bank will look at locations, branch locations, and service areas as profit centers. Now, certainly community banks are interested in profit, but the difference is if a community bank's community fails, there is no way that the business model for that community bank can work. So the community bank can't just pick up and go to another location. A national bank, if they find that an inner city area, a rural area is not a profit center, they close. Community banks simply cannot do that in their business model, and it's kind of self-evident why. Because if you are a local bank, Naugatuck Savings Bank, and Naugatuck fails, well, it's just not going to it's just going to be bad news for your business. So going back to the financial crisis, essentially what happened is larger banks began to really work on high-risk loans, and were very interested in making their next quarter's balance sheet look good for their stock reports. Strangely enough, this was encouraged to a large extent by the federal government and federal auditors, and I can vouch for that as having worked in the banking industry through this period, in that they were very interested in keeping the economy going. So they were not discouraging high risk, poor, what I would consider poor banking practice loans, because in the expansion area of 2005 and 2006, everything was high. Land prices were up, and essentially what they were doing is they were working with a business, with an idea that, well, if things keep going like this, we can really make the economy expand, and the gross national product will do this, and people will do this, and we'll all get reelected. So, unfortunately, high-risk loans have a way of coming back to bite you, and once the boom stopped, the bust happened. This really should have been a validation of community banks who were not into high-risk loans and resisted the temptations that were taken on by national banks and investment banks, and resisted the political pressures put on by auditors. And we were the ones, I think, with varying shades of gray, we were the ones, I think, that were really upheld sound banking practices that matter to people and not to investments and not to the highest end of the income scale. And what ended up happening is we had a very broad snapback in the late 2000s, which have continued to this day, of too big to fail. And there's a really interesting article out right now called Too Small to Succeed, because what has essentially happened is the snapback gave us a lot of regulations which, while well-intended, had a devastating effect on community banks and really were easy to manage for large banks. I mean, and you think about it as a percentage of balance sheet. Community banks had to hire large amounts of people just to manage the regulations, just to manage the compliance. And if the community bank has to spend 8% of its balance sheet on regulations, and not to single them out as being the only one, but if Bank of America has to spend 0.8% on regulations, well, they're going to be pretty happy, because that means community banks are going to contract and national banks are going to expand. So what we've essentially done is, in treating community banks and treating all banks the same, we've essentially made it a situation where you have too big to fail and too small to succeed, which is causing, even among community banks, large amounts of banks to fail, and forcing banks that I have the community bank model to try to grow by merger acquisition and things like that, which make them, sadly, less of a community bank than they would be prior to. Now, this is a very complicated matter. I'm not going to go into all the politics and all the possible solutions, but with that thought in mind, and I'd be happy to take more questions on this, but with that thought in mind, you need to try to understand of the value and uniqueness of what community banks can do for real people, and the underbanked, the poor, the people who would not get banking services, and how we've managed to turn banking on its head and really reward the people at the top end of the income scale and banks that deal with if you treat a bank like Naugatuck Savings with the same regulations as you treat Goldman Sachs, it's just going to work out badly for Naugatuck Savings. So that said,
Norm, that flies in the face of subsidiarity, does it not?
Most definitely, and it's just a matter of it's a matter of really good, really well-intentioned people who are trying to avoid the abuses, and I think our party does that. It specifically mentions too big to fail as we go down into the platform bullet points. But it does. Sadly, we could do even more, and I hope to do better. One of the things that really attracted me to the party, I was a party supporter, gave a small amount of money to the party last year or whatever. But what really got me involved in saying I want to be a part of the action, wanted to be a part of this, is I thought I could add to the banking discussion. So I really think we could do better in terms of how we address public policy, in terms of community banks, mutual savings bank, credit unions, and the types of banking that I think really help the underbanked, the poor, and the people who and the widest swatch of people, and stop catering to the people with bank accounts of over $500,000 and rewarding them and making the playing field so unfair.
Just as an overview here, when we look at St. Thomas, the common doctor, he's very clear about the fundamental structure of natural law. And I would think that part of that fundamental structure is subsidiarity. At the same time, he's quick to say that as we go more and more and more and more towards particulars, particular institutions, particular places, it's more and more obvious that we have to appeal to prudential judgments that are conditioned on a whole range of particulars. It's always seemed to me that a great strength of Catholic social teaching is its fundamental orientation, its fundamental principles, with a recognition that they don't take the place of on-the-ground, hard thinking about particular cases. And it seems to me, Norm, that you're in tune with that. We've got a lot of homework to do, and the homework we do for this week is not going to be the same as the homework we need to do for next week.
Absolutely. And thank you for those kind words. It's really my participation really is just as a discussion starter, not a discussion ender. I don't have a specific end game. I like our platform. One of the things I wanted to add to today's conversation is an invitation in this regard. I've been at my current bank for 32 years. The president of my bank, I have a wonderful working relationship. In fact, I directly reported to him before he took the office of president, is the current national chair of America's Mutual Banks. So an organization that we really should be partnering with and promoting, and because there's a lot of common interest with them and with some of the community bank national organizations. Having said that, and having a direct connection to one of those organizations, I'm for ASP Connecticut. I will be interviewing my former boss, and I would welcome questions from the audience, from the panel, and from other people from just the listening audience who can send questions to me at info@aspconnecticut.org. For my bank president, Chuck Boulier, because I wanted to get his take on the business model of what mutual savings banks are all about, and how they coincide with the goals of our party and our platform, and how they can, and how we can work together for the common good. So I'm throwing that out there because I'll actually have scheduled I see him pretty much every day, but I've actually scheduled a formal time on his calendar in a week or so, and I would welcome questions from a wide range of people to talk about finance, economics, the problems of the poor and the underbanked, and how and what solutions, if any, community banks and mutual savings banks and credit unions can provide.
Thank you. Now, it seems to me that in the past several meetings or panels, we've all of a sudden found ourselves almost out of time. And there are a number of points that we might not get to. So I'm going to skip ahead a few bullet points, and then we can go back. But it seems to me that Norma's already helped us to see, for example, something of the difference between banks and investment houses, and something of the difference between focusing on the local and simply following along with national directions. And so I'm going to skip down to something that has an awful lot of interest for an awful lot of people. Bullet point reads, addressing the student loan crisis. Addressing the student loan crisis by subsidizing extended low interest rate and partial forgiveness, and restoring the ability to discharge student loans in bankruptcy. Let me read that one more time, especially because I've skipped down 4 or 5 bullet points. Addressing the student loan crisis by subsidizing extended low interest rate and partial forgiveness, and restoring the ability to discharge student loans in bankruptcy. Thoughts, and maybe John would want to lead us off here.
Well, it's a very large bone of contention, really, because many young people, especially my generation, they're sold on the idea that in order to succeed, you need a college education. So in order to do that, they take out student loans. But what they're doing is a really risky thing, because student loans are the one thing, or there may be another thing, but it's one of the main things that is not forgiven with bankruptcy. You can't, as far as I know, you can't declare bankruptcy on a student loan. And there's an old joke saying that Bin Laden should have taken a student loan. They would have found him faster. The thing is, though, that these people going into college basically start off with student loans, and I even heard it referred to as an anti-dowry, basically, because chances are you meet your future spouse in college. I mean, it could happen. And if you decide to marry and have a family, you have a double student loan. So you're basically strapped from the very get-go because of student loans.
I have a son and a daughter-in-law who are in hock over $200,000 even as we speak. And to their credit, I think, they're treating the whole thing as you would treat the weather in an intemperate climate. Yes, it's cold. All right, what next?
I would like to make a comment. Can I make a comment about that?
Yes, please.
Okay, I've heard bruited about, which I think is a terrific way of dealing with this student loan process, that if students would not be thinking they're going to get through this college in 4 years, if instead they worked in order to pay their tuition, took 3 classes, 2 classes instead of 4 or 5 classes, and worked enough to pay for the tuition, you would get rid of this whole problem. And so I've heard educators talking about trying to encourage schools where you would have students working, for instance, in big places. You would have much more students working on the campus itself. But I would think, there's a whole anomaly here. I was going to mention that about high-risk loans. It turns out I'm a high risk. This reason, I don't have any debts, and I've never had any debts. So I go to lease an apartment for a year in a big apartment complex here in Corpus Christi, and they tell me, well, we can't put you on a lease because you have no proof of having debts that you pay back since you never had any debts. Is this ridiculous?
Catch 22.
Yeah, but I mean, this whole thing is, the assumption is everybody has to get through college in 4 years by getting a student loan versus now, of course, the big answer to this Holy Apostles has, because we have all these students who work and take courses online instead, and they work their way through to these degrees without necessarily needing any student loans.
That's certainly the case with a shift here and there at Thomas Aquinas College in Southern California. There's a cap put in place by the college that no one will graduate who has a debt of more than, and it's a modest debt. It's a real concern of the school. Unfortunately, because of student loans, it's oftentimes been the case with any number of universities that the tuition rate keeps going up and up and up, because after all, there's going to be a loan process so that the students can pay for the tuition. And they're not going to get away with it because they'll go into bankruptcy. No, they won't. They'll keep paying and paying and paying. And so at the institution where I taught for 40 years, supposedly a Jesuit institution committed to social justice, the room board and tuition for a single year, 1 year, is now around $55,000, $56,000. But that couldn't be sustained were it not for this process of student loans, which will be paid off someday, et cetera, et cetera. So the whole thing leads to a kind of a lack of economic sense on the part of the university administration. And now we're reading about, within the last week, a number of universities that have their endowment linked with the endowment of corporations, and guess where all the money is kept? Cayman Islands. This is just right out of a John Grisham novel.
That from the Paradise Papers, you read that?
That was from a newspaper that I read to keep track of various things.
Okay. I'm interested in doing more research on it. The only reason I asked.
The New York Times within the last week, within the last 3 or 4 days, had an expose on that.
Yeah, but doesn't this argue for? I'm eager to. I already wrote the email to get the book of Joseph Pierce, because what I'm thinking is we have to have an entire revolution in the way we live, back to some sort of Benedict option type of thing.
Get ready.
These ridiculous anomalies that you can't get a lease unless you have debt. I mean, the whole thing is so ridiculous, so absurd by now.
Well, it does speak to the to a lot of convergent themes. If your loan application, your apartment application is tied strictly to numbers, well, that's not subsidiarity now, is it? I think we can agree in terms of student loans that Thomas Aquinas College and Holy Apostles are not the problem. If the world was populated by those two colleges, we would not be having this discussion. But the problem is that, and an interesting point was already made, that by James that the colleges actually contribute to the problem and deserve some fair share of the responsibility for bringing students in. One of the things Joseph Pierce talks about is not living beyond your means, not just taking the most expensive option because you can get there and worry about the loans later. I think that this is beyond the scope of what I can do in 2 or 3 minutes, but it's I think a whole systemic look at student loans is really called for right now due to the people who are suffering because of it.
Very often the sales pitch from the universities is that, yes, there are problems, but over a person's lifetime, if that person has a college degree, that person will make $1 million more than a person without a college degree.
Mm-hmm.
As if the point of education is to make people wealthy. That's quite different. It's not the same as prosperity. Now, going to the next bullet point, are things getting tough? Well, look at this next bullet point, third from the last. Increasing regulation, subsidiarity goes up as well as down. Increasing regulation and controls on alternative forms of credit and finance, such as, block away from me, payday loan and title loan stores, money transfer businesses, and Bitcoin. In the area in which I live, Inglewood, California, also known as Concussion City because we now have 2 NFL football teams. I say we have a Starbucks, place to get your nails done, and a car title loan shop every 2 blocks. Payday loan, title loan stores. It seems to me that those are rightly called to task by the party platform.
I certainly agree. I think we could. One of the things that the American mutual banks advocate is a defined usury rate, of course, subject to change based on future conditions. But I think a defined usury rate of less than 20, any loan being all possible loans being less than 20%, I think is something we should specifically advocate for. And it does get rid of the loan sharks and the people who would really prey on the poor and the people who are down and out and are just desperate for cash.
The sign marquee on the closest place, which is, 3 blocks from where we live, says, with title, 1 hour loan guaranteed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that doesn't sound like sound banking practice. I don't know.
I had a question, if I can interject here. I don't see anywhere within the party platform anything regarding a steady currency. Or maybe they haven't seen it yet or haven't seen the whole thing. But as far as the whole banking and finance, the whole idea of a sound currency doesn't really appear here as far as what we're covering. And I was wondering, is the party basically giving a nod to the current currency situation, or are they advocating for something different?
Do I hear the sound of gold?
Not so much the sound of gold, but what I was just thinking is the currency situation is where all of our U.S. currency is basically backed by debt, and that dollars are loaned into existence. And I was wondering if this kind of currency practice is something that's approved on, nodded to by the American Solidarity Party.
Norm, have you heard discussions of this?
No, I don't think it's specifically addressed. I got to be honest, and it's a complicated matter. I don't know. I think a statement of principle is probably more appropriate than a statement than a full-blown policy statement. But I think they're definitely onto something. I mean, one of the things that we don't discuss very often, and for very good reasons, for at least very well-intentioned reasons, is the problems of currency, of debt, of national deficits, and the problems that creates, not especially for the poor, for the environment, and for our children. And it's as a statement of I think as a statement of principle, we could go a bit farther there, but there's emanations, if I can pick a strange word, that'll lead you there to the party, but we don't really address it. No.
Are you saying it's within the penumbra?
Oh, penumbra and emanations is a whole other matter.
That sounds like it's straight from Plotinus.
Yes.
Could you say a bit, though, about the new currencies that don't involve bills, paper bills, or coins? Like evidently in India, for example, there's a real move in this direction.
I'll actually am going to bow on that one. I don't think I can speak intelligently on that, but I think the principles remain the same.
I think I might be able to speak on that a little bit. To be completely honest, I'm not entirely sure what the intention of the platform is in regard to regulation of cryptocurrency. I am a cryptocurrency investor, and one of the main reasons that people invest in cryptocurrency is that it's difficult to regulate. It avoids regulation. But I'm not sure entirely. I don't really know what the platform authors had in mind when they talk about increasing regulation and control of Bitcoin. I assume that's what you're talking about, Jim.
Yes. I have a son. It seems like any time we talk about something on the platform, I have family members involved who's very keen on those developments and tries to educate me, and it's an uphill effort to educate me on this. But if you have whole countries that are moving in this direction, it's something that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, I have heard that India has wanted to stop cash, and at least in the short term, it's caused major problems, particularly among the poor who don't have access to alternate forms of currency. But I don't know how that'll play out in the long term.
Oh, I think it's good to acknowledge that there's a lot we don't know about.
Yeah.
Jim?
Yes.
Could I just ask something? I would like to have a concrete dream, so to speak, if that's not an oxymoron. Okay. If an American Solidarity Party person became a mayor in a small city, okay, could he or she actually implement a lot of these things so that there would be a model of what life would be like if the planks of the party could be put into reality. I think there was an attempt of some sort of a different nature to do this in Naples, Florida, by Monahan. And it was going to be like a capitalist village down there. But I mean, leaving out his vision. But I mean, with the vision that you guys have, or gals, is there any way that people could see how good this lifestyle would be with all these principles of being implemented, so that it doesn't sound like a utopian thing?
All right, Desmond, you are now the mayor of Chino Hills.
I'm not sure. I'm not really sure how. Well, I know much of our platform cannot be implemented at the local level. I think a lot of it can, but I'm not. I guess I never really thought about how much can a mayor accomplish. I think that there's,
Here's a pump primer. The last plank that we have to discuss. The last plank. Think of how comprehensive the platform is, and that's been a problem for some of the party members. The last plank that we have to discuss is right to life. All right, now you are the mayor of Chino Hills, and at one of the very first of the city council meetings, you suggest that Chino Hills should be a pro-life sanctuary, and that there will be a public statement on the part of the city of Chino Hills that it profoundly regrets the practice of the killing of unborn children, and will do everything that it can to have a sanctuary for those who support life in a consistent way. How does that sound? Did you get some good publicity with that?
Probably. I'm not sure how much of the implementation we'd be able to put together, given the regulations that guarantee, Roe versus Wade and all that.
Mm-hmm. Or would the California Republican Party dismiss you as taking an extremist position that wouldn't market very well, and members of the Democratic Party in positions of power begin a legal investigation? Was that what would happen?
I'm sure that would happen, yes.
Yes, I think so. Yeah. Well, there's room for the whole Thomas More position. We'll follow the law, and we'll follow the law until the law can't be followed, and then we'll speak up clearly and pay up personally. Now, it was on this very program, not more than 6 weeks ago, that I vowed to pay $25 a month towards your campaign. Do you want to give us a mini update on that?
Sure. So I recently have been working with the state chapter, the California state chapter, to figure out how to move forward. And Ross Heckman, I believe that's his last name, right?
Yes.
Offered some great links and some great advice. And I've been reading through the state has a manual on how to go about starting a campaign. It's over 200 pages. It's not very complicated, but it's very detailed and lengthy. So I've been going through that. There are the forms to fill out, and I've started on that too. And then I've got to get a campaign bank account and other stuff before I can actually declare that I will be running. I have not formally decided, or I have not formally committed to run. So that's where I'm at right now.
Well, look, if universities can hide their money in the Cayman Islands, I don't know why you can't put your money in the bank where Norm works.
I hope to get all my paperwork filed this weekend.
Whoa, that's great. Well, as predicted, we're at the end of the hour. I want to thank all of you for your participation, and I'll be knocking on your door, as you know full well. We won't be having a panel on the Friday after Thanksgiving, but that leaves next week, and that would give us a chance to at least begin discussing the plank on the right to life. Rhonda, could you, at 9 o'clock, knowing that we're technically past due, but we always start a minute or two late, could you lead us in a closing prayer?
Oh, come, Holy Spirit, and please give wisdom, insight, and prudence to everyone in the party who is in a position to represent it or to run for office. Amen.
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 Godspeed. God bless. Thank you very much. Stay tuned for next week.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.